This little how-to is about morph targets. And morph targets are really useful when you start to articulate joints. In fact, I've kind of behind the scenes been using them on some of the other projects in this course, some of the things where we articulated the shoulder and the arm, because they're very useful for taking a snapshot of your mesh before an articulation and giving you the ability to quickly switch back and forth between your posed and your default model. Okay, morph targets can be found in the tool menu under the morph target menu, morph target submenu. Okay, and typically what you do is you store morph targets at one snapshot of your mesh, and then you do something to it, and what you can do is you can switch back and forth between your default, your stored target, and what you've just edited. And in fact, you also have the ability to blend back and forth between the two. Okay, and that's cool. The other thing that morph targets allow you to do is to paint back and forth between the stored mesh and your current mesh. Okay, so the brush you use is the morph brush, and the Z intensity dictates or determines how quickly it blends back and forth between the meshes. Okay, I talked about this a little bit in the brush lecture, but you can quickly, if you set your intensity really small, you can get really subtle effects. And I use this a lot to make veins, I've already said, the morph brush anyways. Morph targets in a larger context I use for all my transposing, all my corrective posing for production meshes, corrective sculpting on my own projects, facial expressions. These are so important that typically in my hotkey setup, I have this all mapped for quick access, right? So I have my switch button here, I have my blend slider, and then I have the ability to delete and store morph targets as well. Okay, I'm actually going to switch back to off and delete morph target, and just so I can get rid of that sculpting that I just did. And what I want to do now is I want to show you guys a more useful application of morph targets. Okay, so if you remember in the project that we're currently looking at, we have bent the knee on a layer. Okay, so if I snap this back, this is typically where I would store a morph target, right? So I'm just going to do it down here in my hotkey menu. So I can delete a morph target first. If there's something already there, you need to delete it, and then you need to store a new instance. Okay, so pretty much I've turned my layer off to get the original pose, and now I can turn my layer back on in record mode and go back to my posed knee. Now I'll work over here. It might be easier for people to relate to if I'm in the actual tool palette for a minute. So switch button will snap back and forth between the two, and that's great. You can also use the morph slider to blend back and forth. And rotations don't rotate exactly, but in this small instance it seems to rotate okay. It really is just doing a linear blend between point positions, so it's not really rotating. If this was turning 90 degrees, you would see, or 180 degrees, you would see the mesh go inside out to get to the new target. Okay, so the slider is great, and I'll show you more about that in a few minutes. The first thing that I want to do is move my bent knee more in line with my straight knee. My straight knee is kind of far away, so when I transposed the bent knee, it went a little far back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just switch quickly to my straight leg, and I'm going to make a duplicate of him as a subtool just to use as reference. So down here I'll just go duplicate, and you can see that he's popped up right here. And now I can switch back to my bent leg, and in fact I will turn on transparency which typically would be found way down at the bottom, which I can't reach. And I'm going to transpose my knee forward a little bit, so we're roughly in line with what it was originally. So we'll get a better visual comparison between the two poses. So let's just transpose this guy at level, we can just do it at level 4. No mask is required, just a transpose line. And I'm just going to try to line up some of the features of the knee, maybe the top of the tibia, roughly. Something like this. Okay, and then if I go back to draw mode, step up to level 7, you'll see at level 7 my switch button comes back on, because you can only switch your morph targets at the level you stored it on, which in this case was our highest subdivision, which is level 7. Okay, and so really now I can see that I'm just snapping back and forth between the original pose and this pose. I can get rid of the straight leg that I brought in for reference just by deleting him or hiding him. I'm just hit delete, and it's not undoable, so be careful you don't delete both. I say OK, and now I just have my original leg again. Now, what this is useful for is, I'll just show you, I have switch mapped to enter key on my keypad. So as I'm working, I can just hit enter to see what is stretching versus the original pose, right? So you can see this, that my patella is really stretching, and also the patellar tendon, the quadriceps tendon, is stretching, and we have quite a bit of stretch through here. So this is going to give me the kind of the reference that I need to help me get all these features consistent. Okay, one useful thing here would be to actually turn our texture map back on, just so we have a good idea of the distortion in the shapes. See that? So this is just me hitting the enter button to toggle between morph targets. Okay, so what we want to do is probably to come down to, say, level 3. And I'm going to get the nudge brush and start to slide my patella back into position. Right, because he's stretched quite a bit too much topologically. So we're going to bring him back into the right kind of visual shape, and then I can push him in a little bit, because in this angle the patella doesn't go vertical, he goes slightly recessed. Okay. Now, one of the nice things about morph targets is that even though we can't switch at a subdivision level that's lower than what we stored it at, we can still blend, right? So you can see that I'm essentially bending the knee back and forth with this slider, and just assessing visually at a subdivision different than my morph target was stored on, what's happening with the distortion. And we're pretty close. You can see that maybe, well, we can see where the distortion is really happening now. This distortion is really happening up here in the quadriceps tendon, and a little bit down here. So I'm just going to do a drag mask, and I'm going to do a big kind of slide on the patella shape itself and blend it off here a little bit. And so to save me going back here and using this slider all the time, I've mapped it onto my hotkey. And you can see crazy stuff is happening in the back, and that's where a little bit of mask was happening, a little bit of a stray mask. So we can clear that and look at it a little bit easier like this. And actually it doesn't make sense to mask while we're blending, because the lower leg is moving as well. Okay, so that looked pretty good. Could probably drag this vert down a little bit just to keep it consistent. And then up here, our big problem is that our quadricep is the same shape or the same length as it was at the start, right? So if I morph this, you can see all my distortion is coming in the quadriceps tendon, which is not right. That needs to remain a fixed length. So get your nudge brushes out and start to distribute the pull back to where it needs to be. I'm pretty happy with the patella right now, so I'm going to mask him so he doesn't get too pushed forward. And now just kind of redistribute the length. Really, quadriceps stretches, patellar tendon does not. Okay. So get it to be roughly what you think visually correlates with where it is originally, and then we can check it, clear our mask. The other thing, we'll look at the shape of the condyles. All right, try to get these back to being roughly round. Okay, clear the mask, and let's just blend and see how we're doing. We're doing a little bit better. Probably side view is more instructive. So we can probably blend a little bit of this down further. So stretch happening on the top, and in fact, we're going to be getting compression on the bottom. So the length of the biceps femoris and the other hamstring muscles are going to be shortening, right? And this tendon is going to be rerouting itself a little bit. And we can do a little bit of that with the edge loops just by nudging this down, but we're going to have to do a little bit more topological sculpting to get that to be right. So really I'm just adjusting this flow. Likewise, we can do similar things with sartorius coming down to the knee. But really, we needed to treat this in with more sculpting. This is just adjusting edge flows. Okay, so let's just see how this looks. I think probably what I did here was not useful. We'll just resculpt this. It's kind of breaking the condyle too much. Okay, in general, I think that looks okay as a starting point. The other thing that we want to kind of fix is the gluteal region. So fixed up here at the iliac crest, right? And so all these muscles are going to stretch upwards like this, and they'll lose volume. All right, so I'm actually going to do the loss of volume with the smooth brush at very low intensity. And you see that would just quickly deflate it and give us the appearance of stretching. And I might take some of the volume out of the quadriceps as well, because we've kind of stretched it, but we haven't deflated it. So it needs to conserve. Remember, it needs to muscles conserve volume. If they go long, they go thin. If they're short, they go thick. Okay, now morph again. Looking at the gluteal region, that looks like kind of a fairly natural stretch. And if we wanted to just be a little bit better, we could stretch some of this skin up as well. Let's just have a look from the inside. We haven't assessed this yet. Not bad, not bad. So let's go up to our highest level and just see what happens. We'll turn our texture off, turn our polypaint off, and just hit enter. So you can see that we've actually come a long ways from our original, and is bearing a resemblance to where we need to get to as far as the final sculpt. A lot of the forms in the side need to be refined because this direction of pull down to the tibia is a little different for the iliotibial band and biceps femoris tendon. But in general, I think the quadriceps are doing the right thing. And for a quick high resolution blend, we're looking at that. Okay, so it was a little bit of a working example, but also a how-to on morph targets. I really want to stress that morph targets are really, really cool, and you should try to integrate them into your workflow where it makes sense. And it's really, anytime you're posing joints, if you're doing facial expressions, or even just experimenting with something that you might need to revert, just take a snapshot in your morph target, so delete and store, and then experiment. And if you don't like it, just switch back and you're okay. All right, so morph targets are really cool. Put them in your tool chest. Thanks.